On News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. We have a packed show for you, and our big focus continues to be on the upcoming US presidential election. In this election, Americans have to choose between freedom and chaos. That was Kamala Harris's big message to voters in her highly anticipated closing argument speech in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday night. As was widely expected, the Democratic presidential nominee warned Americans, that Donald Trump is a man consumed by a desire for revenge, and he would open up a floodgate of vengeance against his political rivals, including ordinary citizens. This even as Harris promised that she would work tirelessly for every American. Delivering her speech from the ellipse near the White House, Harris said, "In less than 90 days, either Donald Trump or I will be in the Oval Office. On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list full of priorities on what I will get done for the American people." The site of the speech, carefully chosen by the Harris campaign, was laden with symbolism. The US Vice President stood where Trump had told his supporters on 6th January 2021 to fight like hell, shortly before they ransacked the US Capitol. With the White House illuminated behind her, Kamala Harris asked Americans to elect a new generation of leadership, likening Donald Trump to a petty tyrant who had stood in the very same spot nearly 4 years ago and in a last-ditch effort to cling to power, incited the mob that stormed the US Capitol. Kamala Harris described the 5th November election as an existential choice between the liberties that she promised to protect and the chaos and division that she said would follow Trump back into the White House. She said, "Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him. People he calls the enemy within. This is not a candidate for president who's thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who's unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power. Donald Trump has spent a decade trying to keep the American people divided and afraid of each other. That's who he is, but that's not who we are." The vice president projected herself as the former president's foil, a president who would expand Medicare to cover home health care, where Trump would try to cut the program. A president who would back women's reproductive rights, where Trump would further restrict them. A president who would prize compromise, where Trump feasts on conflict. Harris also made a conspicuous effort to distance herself from the Biden legacy. She said, "My presidency will be different because the challenges we face are different. Our top priority as a nation 4 years ago was to end the pandemic and rescue the economy. Now our biggest challenge is to lower the costs that were rising even before the pandemic and that are still too high." While her speech did not deliver more policy specifics, Harris once again argued that her background, a child of immigrants who became a prosecutor, had prepared her to deliver on her promises. In what would be a matter of grave concern for the Democrats, though, Kamala Harris's lead over Donald Trump seems to have dwindled in the final stretch of the presidential contest, with Harris ahead only by a single percentage point over her Republican rival, 44% to 43% according to a Reuters Ipsos poll that was published on Tuesday. The 3-day poll completed on Sunday shows the race effectively tied ahead of the 5th November election. And the news seems to get worse for Kamala Harris. Donald Trump has nearly erased the Democrats' long-standing advantage among Hispanic men ahead of the election, according to the same Reuters Ipsos poll. The former president now trails Vice President Kamala Harris by just 2 percentage points among Hispanic men, 44% to 46%, compared to his 19-point deficit with Democrat Joe Biden at the same point in 2020. Meanwhile, President Biden has kicked up a storm with his remarks targeting Trump supporters. While slamming and mocking the comedian who spoke at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally and called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, Biden said the only garbage he saw floating were Trump supporters. Now, could this be a self-goal for the Democrats on the eve of the tight race? Many were quick to draw parallels between Biden's remark to the controversial comment made by Hillary Clinton back in 2016 when she had described Trump supporters as a basket of deplorables. While Clinton too had sought to criticize the racism and misogyny that many Trump supporters had displayed, her remark was widely condemned, and many believe it boomeranged on the then Democratic presidential nominee, who ended up losing the election to Donald Trump despite winning the popular vote. Funnily enough, reacting to all the backlash against him and his supporters following the disparaging and racist remarks about Puerto Ricans made at his Sunday rally, Donald Trump termed the rally an absolute love fest. Comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, one of the speakers who opened for Trump, had called the Caribbean U.S. territory of Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage and disparaged Black Americans, Jewish people and Latinos using racist and vulgar language. Launching some kind of damage control, Trump claimed no president had done more for Puerto Ricans than he had. Former First Lady Michelle Obama rallied young voters in Atlanta, urging them to exercise their voting power in the upcoming election and to recognize their role in shaping America's future. She said critical issues from healthcare to reproductive rights were at stake. Obama reminded the crowd that the race in Georgia was decided by less than 12,000 votes in the 2020 election. The question we're asking on Global Lens tonight is this: with almost every poll suggesting a neck-and-neck race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, has either candidate managed to tip the scales in their favor and woo the undecided voters with their speeches in the home stretch of the high-stakes election campaign?
With Election Day now less than a week away, former U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday sought to distance himself from racist comments made at his New York rally on Sunday, while Vice President Kamala Harris held the biggest rally of her presidential run to date. More than 75,000 people gathered Tuesday evening for Harris's rally in Washington, D.C., according to an estimate by her campaign. She spoke from the same spot where Trump addressed his supporters before they attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Look, we know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election.
Harris went on to contrast her vision of leadership with what she described as Trump's.
On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list, full of priorities of what I will get done for the American people.
Meanwhile, Trump on Tuesday appeared keen to move on from the controversy surrounding his New York City rally on Sunday.
There's literally a floating island of garbage,
where a comedian called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage and peddled other racist tropes about Latinos and other minority groups. In Florida earlier in the day, Trump praised that event and said he was honored to be involved.
It was like a love fest, an absolute love fest.
The Trump campaign has said the joke did not reflect its views, though the candidate himself has not directly commented on the remarks. Later on Tuesday, Trump flew to Pennsylvania, the biggest prize among the 7 battleground states that will decide the outcome of the November 5th election. Puerto Ricans are the largest Hispanic group in the state, according to data from the U.S. Census Bureau. At a roundtable in Drexel Hill, Trump touted his record.
I think no president's done more for Puerto Rico than I have.
Trump repeated the line later on at a rally in the heavily Hispanic city of Allentown.
Nobody loves our Latino community and our Puerto Rican community more than I do. Nobody. You know, it's interesting because I've done more for Puerto Rico than any president by far.
Harris has led Trump in every Reuters Ipsos poll since she entered the race in July, but her advantage has steadily shrunk since late September. As the candidates near the finish line, a Reuters Ipsos poll on Tuesday showed that Harris's lead has eroded to just 44 to 43% among registered voters.
And this is an election that's really a choice between whether or not we'll have 4 more years of total failure. This has been the worst 4 years I've ever seen. Gross incompetence, but total failure, disaster under Kamala Harris. Nobody knows I say all the time, if you say Harris, nobody knows who the heck we're talking about, right? And the third reason would be they hate our country. Because who would want to have millions of people coming into our country? Many of them are murderers. Many of them are terrorists. Many of them are gang members from the street MS-13 and almost worse. The Venezuelan gangs are almost worse. And these countries are taking their prisons and they're taking their prison population, putting them in buses and bringing them to our border. Venezuela's got half their prison population has been brought to the United States of America and dumped like we're a garbage can for their people.
Donald Trump has no character. He doesn't give a damn about the Latino community. He's a failed businessman. He only cares about the billionaire friends he has and accumulating wealth for those at the top. He says immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. Give me a break. He wants to do away with the birthright citizenship. Who the hell has said that in the last 100 years? And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable, and it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done, everything we've been.
Look, voting affects everybody, but it especially affects you. So if you want your life and your future to look better, you gotta vote. Because in this election, every issue you can possibly care about is on the ballot. How much comes out of your paychecks in taxes, how much you pay at the grocery store, whether you can afford to ever buy a house, what kind of health insurance you have, who's making decisions about your reproductive health, how the government will deal with AI, America's role in the world. I could go on and on and on. Look, I love this country to death, but we all know we've got a lot of work left to do. And in this country, change takes not days, but decades, y'all. So that can be frustrating.
All right, 6 days to go. What is this contest looking like? It is anybody's election, say the pollsters, and this could go down in American history as the closest presidential election ever. Let's go across to our guest. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, former Indian diplomat, Dr. Monish Thorangbam, Director of the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, and Ajit K. Jha, Senior Journalist. A warm welcome to all my guests and a very happy Diwali to all of you and my viewers. Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, let me start with you. Now, it is being called Kamala Harris's closing argument speech, which she delivered in Washington, D.C. The site that was chosen was no accident. It was laden with symbolism, with Kamala Harris referring to how from the same spot 4 years ago, Donald Trump had incited his mob of supporters who then went on to ransack the US Capitol in unprecedented violence in American history. She tells the voters they have a choice between freedom on the one hand and chaos and division on the other. The question is Kamala Harris preaching to the choir, or do you believe she has managed to win over some of the undecided voters in the last couple of days of this election campaign?
Thank you, Neha, and happy Diwali to you and all your viewers.
Thank you.
I do believe that standing in the shadow of the White House could also be a disadvantage because it links Kamala Harris with all the mistakes and the missteps of the Biden presidency, with which she is closely associated because she is vice president. So when she stands in the shadow of the White House, she also reminds, especially the undecided voters, that she cannot absolve herself from so many strategic and other errors committed by the Biden administration. And therefore, undecided voters may just decide on the opposite, to go the other way. Her lead, so-called lead over Trump, has dwindled to just 1 percentage point. That, in any case, pollsters say is really doesn't mean anything because there's a margin of error of 3 points, which means that she's tied or she could be behind him. So I think that what happened uh, on that fatal night, and I disapprove very much of what happened, has long gone. Much water has passed after that. There are many issues which have happened after that. There have been many missteps by Biden, which and Kamala Harris was virtually an absent vice president for much of the term of the presidency. She only started asserting herself when she became the candidate. So I actually don't believe that it's an advantage. Harris standing in the shadow of the White House, in my perspective, is advantage Trump. That's my perspective.
Interesting. You do not believe that the symbolism actually worked to Harris's advantage. It may well boomerang on her, in your opinion. Let me go across to Dr. Monish Thorangbam. It is true that the Democrats have plenty to worry about right now because, as has been pointed out by the ambassador, in the final stretch of this presidential contest, Kamala Harris's lead over Donald Trump has shrunk. It's now just a single percentage point, 44% to 43%, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll that was published as recently as yesterday. Also, it's interesting that Kamala Harris is making a last-ditch but conspicuous effort to distance herself from the Biden legacy because she said, my presidency will be different because the challenges that we face today compared to the ones that we did 4 years ago are different. Is that too little, too late, you think, for those voters who have been unhappy with the Biden administration? Is it really possible for Kamala Harris to dissociate herself from the Biden legacy so late in the day? And do you believe that she may have managed to convince some of the undecided voters?
Thank you, Neha. Good evening and happy Diwali to all of you. I think, it's too late in the campaign to really, swing too many voters at this point of time. And I agree with what you pointed out in terms of difficulties of this two-pronged difficulty, if I may say, of the Kamala Harris campaign. And also because of the unprecedented nature in which the campaign started, which gives Kamala Harris very little time to, get to the states, each and every state, and get to the voters, specifically in terms of the difficulty of distancing herself from the Biden legacy, because she's still the serving vice president of the Biden administration. And I think if she were to disassociate herself too much with the Biden administration, it would be, it will reflect an ungrateful nature on her part of a man, of a president who stepped, out of the race, and not only stepped out of the race out of pressure, but also was very quick in terms of endorsing the presidential bid of his vice president Kamala Harris. On the other hand, you also have the problem of trying to prove that she is a different kind of person. She will be different from the Biden legacy, and she will be her own president. I think that has been one of the most difficult journey for Kamala Harris in this very, in this very little time that she had. One of trying to disassociate, and also not sounding too indifferent to the Biden administration, of which she is the serving vice president. So I think she continues to have that problem, and it's very late in the campaign, whether speaking in the shadows of the White House, or whether trying to remind the undecided voters of how Trump is going to be a continuous threat to American democracy, and how the American voters should reflect on that and vote otherwise. I think it's a little bit late in the campaign. I think it also is going to depend much now in the final juggernaut to the final day. in terms of the voter turnouts. So you may have voter registration, you may have polls saying a lot of things, you may have a lot of energy on your side, but it all depends. You may have early voting. The precedent shows that early voting sometimes favor the Democratic Party, and the GOP or the Republican Party seems to pick up in the final days of the voting. So we have to see. We have to wait and watch. And I think it all depends on the voter turnouts on this last few days. There have been many cases in American elections where the voter turnouts have told a different story than all the projections and all the polls that pollsters have come out with. So I think it's the last leg of the election campaign, and obviously it will become bitter. They will try their best. They brought in Michelle Obama. They will bring in their star campaigners to the end, but it's almost towards the
brought
end.
out their big guns already.
Yeah, voter turnouts are the main thing that we have to look
Voter
out
turnout is significant. They have brought out their big guns. We've seen Michelle Obama in action. We've seen Barack Obama in action. But is that really going to be enough for Kamala Harris to win the day come the 5th of November? You're saying voter turnout will be significant. Of course, let's not forget that millions of votes have already been cast in the United States thanks to the system of mail-in ballots. Okay, it's interesting. At least two of our panelists seem to believe that delivering her final big speech in the shadow of the White House may not work to the advantage of Kamala Harris. If anything, it may well backfire on her. Ajit Kejha, let me come to you now. What is your assessment of what you've seen of the election campaign in the last few days? Needless to say, it's been extremely bitter. It's been hate-filled. There's been so much bile, bigotry, racism on display. We all saw what happened at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally on Sunday. Funnily enough, as some sort of damage control, later Donald Trump said it was an absolute love fest and that he had done more for Puerto Ricans than any other president. This after one of his supporters called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. But what did you make of Kamala Harris's big speech at the ellipse? And do you believe that she's had enough time in this campaign to convince the Americans and especially the undecided voters that she is the right person for the job? Because a common refrain, even amongst those who might be uncomfortable with the second Trump presidency, seems to be, we don't know enough about Kamala Harris.
Look, Neha, there are various ways one can look at an election. If you look at it purely from the point of view of agenda, of course, there is a fierce anti-incumbency, especially around two issues. The one being economy, especially inflation rate is rather high. Debt is quite high. The economy is not performing very well. So obviously, Kamala stands to lose if agenda is what is important, number one. Number two, immigration. Again, Kamala stands to lose because the way the narrative has picked around on immigration, Kamala seems to be losing out on that. So these two issues really help, Trump, especially among the MAGA voters, especially among the white male voters who have not gone to college, right? And there, Trump has a massive advantage. But let me look at it in another way. Look at the way Kamala's campaign has shaped up. I mean, there was a time, even when Obama and Michelle Obama was not supporting Kamala to begin with, there were divisions inside the Democratic Party. Look at the campaign now. There's a massive unity in the Democratic Party, which you don't see a similar unity in the Republican Party during the campaign. In fact, Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney are all campaigning, Anthony Scaramucci. These are all hardcore Republicans, right? And they are with Kamala Harris. We don't see too many Democrats on the side of Trump. So as far as the campaign is concerned, even though Kamala is the underdog, look at the trend in the campaign. Any poll, you will not see even once Trump leading over Kamala Harris when it comes to popular vote. You know, it's typical to all sort of people who do whatever, when people watch pollsters, when a contest comes closer, the difference between the winner and the loser becomes less. So obviously we see a tightening in the race. But look at it from a long-term perspective, especially since July when Kamala came. She has always led. Now, if we see the margin of error, then the point is every time in the margin of error, 1 or 2 point advantage to Kamala Harris. So as far as the popular vote is concerned, I think Kamala Harris has an advantage. The problem is, given the fact that in America, electoral college votes are very important, especially among the swing states, in the swing states, at least some of the swing states are Republican bastions, right? And there Trump has an advantage. But let's take one example. Take Pennsylvania. The governor, of course, is Josh Shapiro, who is a Democrat, although Pennsylvania is a typical Republican state, I would argue. But look at what has happened. This comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, when he referred to the Puerto Ricans as a floating island of garbage, look at what happened as a result. You have very sort of, number one, Puerto Rican rapper, Bad Bunny, who has a 45.6 million Instagram followers, endorsing Kamala immediately after. Luis Fonsi, again, a similar thing, right? Jennifer Lopez. Look at all the celebrities in Hollywood, Beyonce, several others I can go on naming. All of them campaigning, endorsing Kamala. Now, that I think has a tendency to sometimes change the margins, change the balance a little bit. We still have 6 days, but the kind of campaign that Obama is doing, the way he's ripping apart, let's say, President Trump. For example, the issue that, some voters believe that during Trump, the economy was better. Obama goes on reiterating that was because he gave Trump 75 consecutive months of employment, higher employment surge, right?
Yes.
So
that it was in spite of Trump and not because of Trump. You're quite right. Okay. Yes.
So all I'm saying is, when it comes to agenda, of course, because Kamala is a de facto incumbent, being the vice president, she has a disadvantage. But when it comes to campaign, I think the Democrats have done a much better campaign than the Republicans. Now, it all depends on if turnout rates turn out to be very high, like the way when Biden was selected. I think Kamala still has
an edge, you believe? Okay, yeah. So you seem to be the only panelist on the show who seems to think that Kamala may have an edge over Trump. The others seem to think that there is plenty for Kamala Harris and the Democrats to worry about. Of course, you're right in pointing out how so many celebrities have come out and endorsed Kamala Harris, not just in recent days, big names like Eminem, Beyonce, Jennifer Lopez, but even in the past, pop icon like Taylor Swift. But will that be enough to get the Democrats to come out of their homes and cast their ballots in favor of Kamala Harris? And will that be enough for the fence-sitters to decide to vote in favor of Kamala Harris? We will look at the complexity of the US presidential election, especially in the context of the Electoral College, in just a moment after this quick break.
Hey, why are so many lights on? Is it Navroz?
Settling accounts, uncle?
No, writing a love letter. Check your accounts every day and ensure there is no mismatch. Exchange sends trade-related messages daily. Do timely verification. And if there is a mismatch, inform the exchange immediately.
सोच कर, समझ कर, invest कर.
This is News 9 Live, India's only digital exclusive live stream. For the early adopters, bringing you the news 24/7. For the smart audiences on the smartest TVs. News 9 Live. Stream now on your smart TVs.
Joe Biden is not going to be the Democratic presidential nominee.
I made my choice. Kamala Harris. She's experienced. She's tough. She's capable.
I took on perpetrators of all kinds, predators. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
I am the one saving democracy.
He has tapped into the fear and anxiety about demographic change in the US.
This polarization in the United States. Some people are even suggesting that there could be a civil war.
You are this unable to solve your own domestic problems. You have no right to claim to be anybody else in the world, and we're moving into a multipolar world where the United States will not lead.
This and more. Streaming on News 9 Plus. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're discussing the US election with just 6 days to go before voters decide who is going to be the next president of the United States of America. Let me go back to Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee at this point. Ambassador Mukherjee, before we look at the big picture once again and, look at the complexity of the Electoral College, I'd like you to weigh in on a controversy that President Biden seems to have triggered. When he was slamming this comedian for calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, he said the only garbage I see floating is Trump supporters. Now, this has been widely condemned, and people were very quick to draw parallels between this comment and one rather controversial comment that was made by Hillary Clinton back in 2016 when she described half of Trump's supporters as a basket of deplorables. She was referring to the racism, bigotry and misogyny of some of those people that had been on display, but it seriously boomeranged on her, and we know how that contest ended. Hillary Clinton, despite winning the popular vote, ended up losing the election to Donald Trump. Do you believe this could be a self-goal by the Democrats on the eve of the election, one they could have done without?
Definitely, Neha. In fact, it also shows that Biden is becoming increasingly mentally incapacitated by making such a comment, because he is actually insulting a huge number of voters, including potential voters who were undecided and may just decide to go the Trump way. I also wanted to add, Megha, because you mentioned before the break about Obama campaigning very seriously. So it is important to understand why Obama is doing that. The reason for that is that according to Black American history, the blacks vote for those who are descended directly from the Africans. So, for instance, Michelle Obama, her ancestors came from Senegal. They were slaves, and they were liberated in the Deep South, etc. In the case of Kamala, she first alienated the Indian voters by saying that she is black, and she believes that she is black. But her father is Jamaican, and Jamaica does not count for an African American vote as an African American. That is a huge disadvantage. That is why Obama is trying to swing the vote, because the black African male is not enthused by Kamala. I thought I should make this additional point because there are many in India who don't understand the nuance, but because it's also linked to the slave trade, because the Caribbean was linked to the slave trade, and therefore the votes go instinctively to those who are of direct black African descent. That is an extremely important point That is a huge disadvantage that Kamala Harris has. I thought I should make the additional point and also point out that Elon Musk can swing millions of votes, and Elon Musk had become one of the strongest supporters of the Trump campaign. I think he counts much more for swinging American voters than any of the celebrities mentioned before the break. These factors need to be kept in mind when we talk about the 1% gap, which means that you could have this time Trump winning the election with the popular vote and the electoral college, whereas earlier there was talk that he may lose the popular vote but win the electoral college. He could win both the way the election is shaping.
He could win both. It's interesting. You believe Elon Musk's endorsement of Donald Trump's candidacy counts for much more than the endorsement of a whole slew of other celebrities, including Taylor Swift and Jennifer Lopez, does for Kamala Harris. And also, you're right, there are many Americans for whom Kamala Harris is not black enough. Let me take this to Dr. Monish Turangbam. Dr. Turangbam, two questions for you. One, do you agree with Ambassador Bhasati Mukherjee that, questions continue to be asked about whether Kamala Harris is black enough for the black Americans to vote for her, especially the men? And what explains this? The Reuters Ipsos poll that was published yesterday, which we quoted in the earlier segment, also seems to suggest that while in 2020, the Democrats had a 19 percentage advantage over the Republicans among Hispanic men, Donald Trump has almost erased that advantage for the Democrats, because now he trails by just 2 percentage points among Hispanic men, 44% to 46%. Now, you would think that given the kind of attacks that have been made repeatedly by Trump and his supporters on immigrants, many would say an attack on the minorities in a sense, this is a demographic that would prefer to go with Kamala Harris. But going by this particular poll, the reality on the ground may actually be rather different.
Yeah, right. Neha, those are brilliant questions. I think before answering that, I'll just pitch in for the celebrity question. And just want to point out that in 2016 as well, very quite early, many of the celebrities from Hollywood and usually the celebrities were already behind Hillary Clinton, and that was not enough for Hillary Clinton to win the election in 2016. So we have, I just wanted to play a devil's advocate in terms of really sort of like putting a question mark on the influence of celebrity voting, celebrity influence on voter turnouts in the last leg of the election. To your questions pointedly, I think, there is an element of gender also here, a bit of question of misogyny as well. And, one element that we have to also remember is that the black votes and the Hispanic votes are not monolithic. They are not preordained and granted for the Democratic Party. And elections have quite proven that, and the polls are also proving that in some sense. Michelle Obama coming out in full gust for Kamala Harris also points out to the lack of support, within key demographics, within key subsections of the black voters in America. We also have to remember that religion also cuts into this racial identities. You still have to consider the element of evangelicals, Catholics voting within USA. I think Joe Biden was able to cut into the Republican base of evangelical voters and Catholic voters in 2020. I'm not very sure to what extent the Kamala candidacy is going to really cut into the conservative religious base of the votes. So I think religion also cuts into this racial identities. One is gender, because there is a big question mark, especially on the young male black voters of America, whether they are going to stand up and vote for Kamala or not. This has been an alarm bell ringing, and that's why Barack Obama had to come out and speak so strongly to the black voters for Kamala. And I think regarding the Hispanic, you are right. If you were to go by all the mud that has that the Republican campaign has thrown on immigrants, I think it should have gone the other way around. This also points to the fact that the Hispanic votes are not monolithic. One, as I mentioned, religion. The other is there's a lot of studies which proves that older immigrants who have settled in the US are doing well in their status among the Hispanic voters in the US are not necessarily very supportive of new illegal immigrants coming into the United States, and as they believe spoiling the good image that they have built in the United States. So I think this is also something that studies have proven, and this it also accounts into the complexity of the Hispanic votes that you earlier mentioned too. And last but not the least, I would like to also mention that even in 2016, when Trump won, many former Republicans went against Trump. They wrote letters against Trump. And that was not enough for Hillary to win the election. I'm not predicting here who is going to win and who is going to sort of push it ahead, but I'm just sounding as a devil's advocate in terms of picking out some of the complexities in the voting patterns in the US.
Quite right. Endorsements are hardly anything one can go by to predict the outcome of an election as complex and unpredictable as this. And it's interesting and important, the point you make about how you believe the black vote and the Hispanic vote is not a monolithic vote. Ajit Jha, you're somebody who understands numbers very well. Do you agree with that point that has been made by Dr. Turangbaum? And also, I want to ask you, the intersectionality of gender and race that Kamala Harris is up against, could that prove to be a very big challenge and even obstacle for her in this race? And if you could explain to our viewers, why is it that in the United States of America, you can win the popular vote as Hillary Clinton did in 2016 and still lose the election, thanks to the Electoral College?
Okay, Neha, let me quickly begin with the gender issue. If gender is the most critical issue in this election, and I think it should be, given the fact that 20 states of America today, you cannot have abortion, right? Which it used to be before Roe versus Wade was overturned. If gender picks up, the salience of gender becomes important, there is a tsunami of support for Kamala Harris. If you look at on the gender issue, in fact, she's drawing from all women, white women, black women, Latino women, Asian women. The gender gap in voting has never been higher than this election ever in the US history, something between 10% to some voters, some pollsters point out, more than 20%. So I'm saying women are overwhelmingly voting for Kamala, number one. When it comes to race issue, again, of course, we know no community in the world ever votes as one community. There are always divisions. For example, anyone with a salary above $400,000 annually is likely to vote Trump. Why? Because they'll get tax benefits, right? So obviously all communities, like let's take the Indian diaspora, most of these doctors, many of the IT professionals whose salaries are very high, they are hardcore Trump supporters. So all races cut across with these economic status. But what is interesting, if you look at the black voters and the Latino voters, both the voters are, in terms of sheer number, according to all pollsters, are polling more for Kamala than Trump. Now, then why the worry? The worry is because when Biden won 4 years ago in 2020, he got overwhelming support from Latino and black male voters. That overwhelming support from black male and Latino male voters are not coming yet for Kamala Harris. And therefore the worry is not that the black and Latinos don't consider Kamala to be authentic, as someone else pointed out. That is not the problem. The problem is that what Biden got, and Biden beat Trump. So basically, pollsters are looking at 2020 election, and they want that kind of turnout, that kind of rooting of black voters across gender, Latino voters across gender. That is where they are working, and therefore Obama comes and supports Kamala, and therefore I think people like Bad Bunny, Luis Fonsi, and other Puerto Rican, let's say, rappers and others who are now endorsing is obviously bound to affect the male Latino voters, the Puerto Rican voters. Take one example, because you asked me to draw a difference between electoral college vote and popular vote. See, what happens in the US in simple terms is that Republicans, hardcore Republican identified voters, and Democratic voters are almost sort of 50-50, right? Take, for example, California. It's a Democratic state, highest delegate. Take Texas, second highest Republican. So similarly, the larger states, if you see, it comes to almost 50-50. There are 7 to 10 swing states or battleground states. For example, Arizona, for example, Pennsylvania that I was talking about, Michigan, Florida, I could go on and on, Nevada. So over here, this territory is interesting. There are two bits. Two of them, Arizona, Nevada, is next to California. They vote somewhat more Republican. Similarly, if you take the other, let's say about 5 or 6 states up close to, let's say, New York, that area, or even north, close to the sort of the lake area, there you have two different kind of patterns. And then they kind of switch between elections. So it is important for Kamala to win the delegates from the swing states in order to get 270. I feel one of the biggest question mark, that one of the biggest mistake that Kamala had done when she selected the vice president, she did not take the Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor. According to me, she should have, but she went for, Tim Walz. Now, my point is that given the fact that you have 500,000 Puerto Rican voters sitting in Pennsylvania, this remark by this, Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian, when he referred to Puerto Ricans as garbage, a island of garbage, is going to affect the Latino voters. The Latino voters, to some extent, might swing. To what extent they'll swing, I don't know. We have still to find out. We have 5 days left. But, and it's a very tight race. As I said, Kamala Harris is the underdog. Of course, Trump starts with an advantage. He's male, he's white, and, he's mainstream America because you have majority white voters. And the interesting thing is, because the economy is hurting, because there was deindustrialization in America, where industries moved to Mexico, 6,000 industries from southern part of America had moved to Mexico.
Right.
So what happened? White males lost their job. Now they are hurting, and they blame the Biden administration. They blame Kamala Harris. Therefore, you find the MAGA supporters very aggressive for Trump. But I still think there is a window of opportunity if Harris campaign sticks to the building of social coalition as they did. If they don't make the mistake that Biden made, for example, that you pointed out, I still think she has a chance in the elections on 5th of November.
Ultimately, it all boils down to the swing states. And let's remind ourselves that President Biden, who had won the popular vote against Donald Trump by 7 million votes, ultimately had a victory margin of just 77,000 votes when it came to the Electoral College. That's how tricky it can get. That's how close it can get. And many are predicting the Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump contest could in fact be the tightest and the closest ever in American